Welcome to Risk Matters, the insurance podcast brought to you by DWF and your global guide to the latest trends and issues in the insurance and reinsurance industry. Join us as we explore topical issues, emerging technologies, and the innovative strategies that are shaping the global future of insurance.
Welcome to another episode of Risk Matters, the DWF Insurance Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined today by Jamie Taylor, a director in our cyber and data team, and by Ollie Price, a director at SRM who specialises in, incident response and with a history of work in network security and network systems. Just to sort of set the scene, I expect in terms of incident response, it's useful to bear in mind, because I think the three of us have sort of been around the block a few times now, that it's been quite a long journey and it's evolving. Law, perhaps in particular for Jamie and I, sort of chugs along, but Ollie, your space is rather more dynamic, I guess, in the great scheme of things.
It certainly threatens to be. I think it's been interesting in the preparation for this. I was looking back into the NotPetya attack against Ukraine in 2017, and the memory doesn't quite sit right. I had to go back and look at what the original ransom note was. It was like ransom notes of the day. It demanded $300, which I'm sure for those of us that have done a ransomware case recently, I wish that was the ransom these days for most of these cases.
Piece of paper nailed on the door or something like that. Yeah, I mean, I was doing something very similar, and remembering when I was doing some work experience at solicitors' firms, and you had to sort of almost clamber through corridors full of paper. People had desks piled high with paper. And even as a trainee, I think, the reliance on sort of the IT kit was pretty modest. We had a bit of word processing. We might have used stuff for, say, financial record keeping and things like that. But most of the day-to-day work was paper.
Think back to the first ransomware, and it was on floppy disk, I think, 1989. So things have changed quite a bit.
But it meant that I think that sort of changes the dynamics as well. And because it's incremental, I think a lot of businesses that didn't think they were tech businesses actually went on a journey where they were more reliant on tech than they thought. And certainly, say, a classic law firm, where now you'd have perhaps your case management systems, your client systems, your financial systems, your email, all your documents. Most people, well, a lot of people, will be paperless now. So you've got two things, I guess. One is you've got a vast amount of data on your systems. And the second thing is you're increasingly reliant on your systems. And that, I think, from an external bad actor perspective, creates a sort of opportunity. It's the value of the data is enormous. So in the same way that one might have, I was thinking on the way over, a sort of a large amount of money in a bank, a large amount of data on a system is hugely attractive to an attacker. And if you couple that with businesses' reliance on the system and that sort of ransom element, where if the system's not available to you, that causes you a lot of problems. You've got a real opportunity for the bad sort of the threat actors to come and try and take advantage. And does that, I guess, for the two of you, in terms of your journeys, have you seen the sort of severity and frequency of incidents? Is that the upward track that I would expect?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if there's one constant, it's that threat actors have continued to evolve over time. So, think about if you're a threat actor deploying ransomware, one of the barriers to entry that you used to come across is having to have your own encryption malware. You had to develop that. So, of course, what threat actors did over time, they developed the ransomware as a service model so they could scale up massively. And that's what we've seen over the last
like a sort of franchise
10 plus years. Yeah, and there's so many examples, aren't there, of how threat actors have evolved in response to organisations trying to protect themselves better. Of course, we've had perhaps the most obvious example in response to encryption. Companies have upped the game in terms of the backups. So they now have air-gapped and immutable backups. In response to that, threat actors have pivoted to exfiltration. We've had a massive uptake in multi-factor authentication over the years. Threat actors again have pivoted and now are deploying attacks such as MFA bombing, attackers in the middle, in order to bypass those sort of MFA controls. In recent times, we've seen a lot of law enforcement activity, taking down some of the big players in ransomware, the Contis of this world, the Lockbits, the Alphys. But very, very quickly, we see new entities emerge, Ransom Hub, for example. So the threat actor evolution just continues to develop. I saw some stats recently, I think it was from Chain Analysis, that in 2023, the amount of ransom payments, so not ransom demands, but ransom payments, was about 1.1 billion just in those 12 months. So that, I think, speaks volumes as to how the severity and the volume has increased.
Threat actors aren't doing this thing because they enjoy getting better at being threat actors and criminals. They're doing this because they're being challenged by organisations that are getting better. If criminals could make as much money as they wanted doing what they did 7 years ago, they'd still be doing it. I think what we're really seeing is, this is an adversarial problem. The goodies and the baddies are vying here, and it's very much a call and response. I think also being aware that the cybersecurity space is a bubble within a bubble. It's being impacted a lot by the effects of digitization, by soon sort of AI, but this additional fragility that's coming into the system, I think, has very much played into their hands. As organizations move away from paper to having stuff on computers, that's incredibly efficient, allows the business to move quite quickly, but it does make it more fragile. We saw that during the novel COVID pandemic, where supply chains became fragile because they were spread out. And I think we see exactly the same situation that's playing into this ransomware card. I don't think there's a good alternative. I'm not suggesting we go back to working on paper, but it is a thing for organisations to be aware of.
There's still a school of thought out there. I don't think it's particularly popular now, but it certainly exists, that when it comes to backups, because threat actors got so good at infiltrating the backups themselves, are old-fashioned tapes a better solution? They're not sort of electronic. That's one option. But the other observation I think I have is that against that threat landscape that we've seen, the law has also evolved. Wouldn't say it's quite kept pace, but for example, we've gone from Data Protection Act 1998, where there was no mandatory breach reporting regime, albeit it was still encouraged by the regulator at the time. And we're now in a situation, of course, we have the GDPR sort of 72-hour time frame. If you're a telecoms provider, you might be required under PECA to notify within 24 hours. If you're a payment service provider, you might be required to notify within 4 hours under PSD2. So timescales are getting shorter, and that, of course, is a reaction to the severity of the threat that these organisations are facing.
And then in terms of perhaps the threat actors, one can see, I expect that cybercrime is so much more straightforward in some ways than physical crime, because you can do it to anyone from anywhere. And in an era where working from home is a thing, someone with the right
jurisdiction agnostic,
and you've got all the kind of, I guess, challenges one might have. We look at, if we are dealing with organisations that are the victims of thefts or say the financial diversions we see, actually tracing the money can be phenomenally difficult because of that, because you find that the money will ping around lots of different jurisdictions. But it does mean that you can't just look within your own sort of jurisdiction for the risk. You're trying to manage a risk that is sort of extra jurisdictional, that could come from anywhere, and that makes the challenges even more difficult for both of you, I guess.
Some of these cyber criminals, they operate, I won't say with impunity, but sometimes it's not far off that, particularly if they're in territories where, is their activity state-sponsored, or is the state simply turning a blind eye? Certainly they know it goes on. So it's very difficult if you're the victim organisation, identifying precisely who it is, who are the attacker, who is the threat actor, where are they located. And as you say, Tim, trying to then trace a Bitcoin payment through the Bitcoin chain is tremendously difficult.
And that's it. Attribution, so literally just knowing who's done this, is difficult and therefore really quite expensive. And therefore for a private organisation to try and do that themselves would be it is a very heavy burden. It's not the kind of burden that we expect organisations to take on with physical crime.
I guess starting with that incident response piece and that, I've been hit. What do I do? We're probably the ones operating the hotline as the call comes in. Jamie, do you want to sort of talk our audience through that first sort of call and what happens, what we're looking to do?
Well, let's give the proper context to that first call, because you'll be dealing with an organisation who's probably experiencing the most stressful day of their professional lives, or certainly one of them. And you might have on the call perhaps a GC, general counsel from the business, and also somebody from the IT who's responsible for security, perhaps a CISO, if they have one. That IT person will be feeling particularly stressed and vulnerable, because it's their job essentially to look after security. So you need to display, as the external counsel, empathy towards that person's position, because their worry and stress, it does have some logic behind it, because we've seen recently, haven't we, some personal liability attaching to executives, for example in the Uber case, SolarWinds, also a case called Drizzly. So that empathy towards the victim organisations is an important piece. The other bit of important context to that first call is that the priority, and often I as external counsel will need to emphasise this point to the victim in the first call. The initial priority is all about containment, stopping the bleeding, stopping the threat actor from perpetrating further attacks against the company, exfiltrating data. It's often the case, understandably, when you're speaking to a client for the first time, they want to skip the containment and eradication steps and jump straight to recovery. I can think of one case in particular, for example, just quickly, where we got a call, the very first call. By the time we received that call, the client was already 3 days deep into the breach. They'd been muddling their way through as best they could on their own, got to a point where they couldn't cope, phoned us for support. It transpired by the time they called us, they had already completely wiped the affected servers. So the idea of preserving and collecting digital evidence had just gone out the window. So with that context out of the way, my first question's usually going to be, are we confident this line, this telephone line, Teams platform or Zoom platform, is it secure? How do we know that? And there's a well-worn phrase in incident response, assume compromise. My next question is going to be, are you insured? Every cyber policy will usually require the insured to notify their insurer in a timely manner, particularly of a ransomware attack. And if they don't do that, they might jeopardise the cover. After that, we really get to the information gathering phase. So I'm in listen mode, I'm asking questions, what happened, how did it happen, what part of the network was compromised, do you have backups still, are they in a good state, what's their status, how many endpoints do you have, what's your operating system, and who's responsible for your security? Do you handle it yourself, or do you have a third-party managed service provider? And I need answers to that, not just for my own benefit so I can assist the company, but also because I know my next call is going to be to Ollie, and to give Ollie a heads up so he can come to the follow-on call slightly prepared is obviously really important. Other things we want to know, what have you done so far? What actions have they taken? Have they deleted anything? Who have they called? Have they notified anybody? And what resources do they have internally? What internal capabilities do they have? And what external support might they require? As I'm asking all these questions, going on in my head is a sort of a running risk assessment. So I'm thinking, what is the timeline? When were they breached? What regulatory notification clocks have already started ticking? So while that's going on at the same time, and I'm working out what support do we need. Typically, as we all know, it's sort of digital forensics. It's a PR crisis communications expert, obviously legal counsel, and if it's a ransomware incident, then a sort of counter-extortion ransom negotiator are typically the external disciplines that we'd look to bring in as a an urgent first step.
And then are we sort of at that point thinking about the nature of the organisation, what they do, what information they hold as well, in terms of sort of feeding that into your regulatory thinking and strategic?
Exactly. I mean, a deeper dive on that would probably come into the second call, but certainly when you're asking those initial questions about what part of the network was impacted, what servers, you'd also want to know at the same time, ideally, what sort of data do we think was on those servers. And sometimes the client will know, but quite often that they won't know.
And then, without being too silly, but what are the things that put a smile on your face in that situation? What are the things that make your heart sink in terms of the answers you get?
So talking about what makes me feel like this is going to be a successful call, there are probably clear ones. There's they've got good backups, we know they're great. It hasn't impacted large parts of the network. I think sort of a softer side of this would be that there's a skeptic on the call. I think a lot of us are, the reason why we're good at this is because we walk into the call and we absolutely listen to what we're hearing, but we know that might not be the absolute ground truth.
Does that influence as well? I presume that goes into the mix with that people dynamic that Jamie was talking about, that we know that this is a distress situation for the victim, that people are under the cosh, there's a huge amount of pressure, and we've got to arrive with a cynical mindset, as you say, but we've got to reassure people that isn't because we don't believe them. It's
and that's it. You've got to set out this is, we're standing shoulder to shoulder with you. We absolutely believe what you're saying, but we need to verify that something else hasn't changed that in the meantime. Is broadly the way you're coming to this. Particularly when you start saying, okay, we're now going to start notifying regulators or putting out press statements, because there's someone who's sitting out there who would love to be able to say, that's not how it is, it's actually this. There's someone that's willing to immediately rebut that. Potentially he's had access to your systems for months.
Yeah, and the usual course of events would be in those first 24, 48 hours, you probably know very little. And even the things that you think might not be correct. Threat actors these days, they'll deploy measures such as, anti-forensics. They'll cover the tracks. They'll sort of delete logs. They'll try and distract you. There's the risk of secondary attacks. So you need to bear all these things into account and work through things properly. So once we've made the phone calls, we've got our experts on board, our team. There then becomes some fairly significant operational considerations to work through, because if you are bringing in, several external third parties to work alongside several internal parties, you can't assume that's just going to run itself. There needs to be a significant element of project management, and what you certainly can't have is everybody, from forensics, comms, legal, in the same meeting together. So we split out into separate work streams so things can be done in parallel at the same time.
Should we run through, perhaps for our audience, what we're going to be looking at in that situation in terms of what streams we'll be looking at and who we'll be bringing in?
But typically, as I mentioned earlier, it's forensics, it's PR comms, it's a ransom negotiator. Even if the client is adamant they don't want to pay the ransom, there's still a logic for having that ransom negotiator at the table for reasons we can come on to. External legal counsel, obviously, and they're the main ones at the start. You might want additional ones as you get further down the line. For example, there might be a stream on restoration, remediation. There might be a stream on data analysis. But initially, it's those core ones we've talked about. So, as I say, there are operational things that need to be done to get those streams up and running properly. So who's going to lead each stream? How frequently are the meetings going to take place? What's the cadence of meetings? So typically you'd have a morning meeting, you'd have an afternoon, end of day meeting. You'd want to know, who is the ultimate decision maker client side? So who's got the no or no-go call on all of the big decisions that you're going to have to make? And then there's some operational structures you will need or would want to have things like a decision log, an action tracker. Those artifacts are things that can help you when you come on later down the line to deal with regulatory inquiries. From the legal side, everything I've just talked about, we would be looking to wrap that in a legally privileged envelope to protect the client from a sort of confidentiality perspective. And obviously there's steps we need to work through to achieve that.
Certainly with a sort of litigator's hat on and a claims hat on, you see all of that sort of material is being requested by claimants very early on. So we need to be alert to the fact that one day, if there is a claim or a group action, whatever it might be, people are going to be knocking on the door asking for that. So that's a crucial piece of the...
Yeah, you might still be on day one, but you're having to think about what are the downstream implications, weeks, months, years down the line potentially. So for if we start with forensics perhaps as the first work stream to chat in more detail about, ideally it would be external counsel instructing Ollie, perhaps through a sort of tripartite agreement with the insurers, to sort of ensure that privilege is in place. And what that would essentially look like is the letter of engagement would speak to Ollie's being instructed in order to assist the lawyers with the technical aspects of the breach, in order to inform legal advice that we would give to the victim organisation. And so that's how you'd sort of go about setting privilege up. You'd also look obviously to carefully control the parameters of the investigation.
From the moment Jamie calls you, then Ollie, what's going through your mind in terms of what have I got to do? Is there a sort of a broad playbook for you in terms of?
Definitely, and I think that the broad outline that Jamie's given there is true for every single player in that role below. It's going in, trying to get as much information as possible, understanding how we fit within the wider whole, because all of those different work streams need information from all the others. We need to make sure that we're all playing to the same score here without necessarily having to sit on a meeting with 20 different people. So making sure that all of that communication is in place is really clear. That priority around making sure that you're containing the incident before you start to remove things for secure recovery as well. What are the agreed procedures that you're following there? Bearing in mind that in many of these situations, this is a client we don't know the ins and outs of their infrastructure, so we want to be really clear when we're doing something, it's not going to be something potentially disruptive. So make sure that's clear. Being really aware of what systems are fragile, which systems are critical to the business that are still running. You don't want to hurt them on the way up. But also being as clear as possible about the fact that things might get worse in the short term. If you want them to get better, there may be things you need to be turning off. There may be some actions that they've already taken that you need to roll back. So being really clear that sort of slowing down, making deliberate decisions to contain the incident, to stop the bleed, to protect the data that you still have is critical. The business can then, JB's done his excellent work of identifying the key decision makers, making sure that they can be briefed on things, so that when we bring them questions, or I wouldn't want to call them problems, but challenges, you've got a situation where it's going to take us a week in order to do the forensic analysis on a particular piece of hardware, but that's so critical to the business that if it's not brought up in a week, that the business isn't going to exist anymore. Who's actually making the ultimate decision on whether or not you get to proceed without doing the investigation? So our job is to provide the advice. It's going to, this is so critical to our investigation, we're not going to know. But obviously that's completely useless if that's not going to the right decision maker. So there's that. And then finally, the point here around making it really clear when we're advising the client what they're likely to know when. I think that one of the most uncomfortable things for senior executives that we see in these incidents are they're used to having a good amount of information about the things that they're trying to make a decision on. And unfortunately, incidents aren't like that. You start off knowing basically nothing and having to make some pretty impactful decisions in usually a subject area you're not familiar with. And that's incredibly uncomfortable for almost everybody. I wouldn't want to sit in that chair. So trying to give them an idea as to what they can expect the next day, week, month to look like, you know, it might be bad now, but it's going to get better, basically, is important, is critical. And it's also a thing that generally internal teams struggle with because they're going through that same journey themselves.
And from an IT perspective, perhaps what I've seen is certainly that internal teams can be primarily focused on some functionality and on the day-to-day running of the system, and that security piece is slightly different. You might have, as we do, I guess, IT security architect specialists, but they perhaps have got a different approach, a different skill set to you and your team, because you're coming into a sort of distress situation with a business that's been hit with encryption and on getting that back up to speed and back on the straight and narrow is a slightly different skill set. So it's complementary blend. You need presumably to work with the internal team, but also bring your own.
Yeah, and or work with any third-party MSP. And thankfully, in the vast majority of cases, the client will be doing everything they can to give Ollie everything he needs in terms of access, information requests, log evidence, whatever it may be. But we have had a case or two, haven't we, Ollie, that we've worked on where that hasn't been the case, and where a sort of third-party MSP has actually been instructed not to hand over certain material.
It didn't add up.
No,
Yeah.
And so what that meant, as well as creating a delay in the incident response, it also meant on the legal side that mid-breach you're having to deal with other issues such as potentially liability of the MSP, the sort of the third party, the potential HR issues if people aren't handing over what they should be handing over or properly cooperating. So things can get a lot more complicated. And of course, another thing we haven't touched on yet, for those larger breaches that have an international element, there might be 3, 4, 5 plus different C-suites. So there's CISO in Europe, a CISO APAC, CISO in the Americas, all of whom want to input into how best respond to the breach, and probably in some cases, Ollie, it makes your life a bit harder.
Definitely. I mean, when you end up with those really complicated situations where you've got different C-suites or a sort of a group organisation, and particularly when you start dealing with multiple different jurisdictions of law enforcement, I think that's where that can become really complicated. We've got the Italian postal police knocking on the door asking about something at the same time as you've got the FBI in the US, making sure that you can answer the questions sensibly, take in the information they're giving you, because also, depending on the size of the organisation and the type of breach, they might be telling you something. You'll never know where that's coming from. You don't know how true or accurate that's necessarily going to be, not because they're trying to mislead you, just because you're a much smaller piece of a much wider whole, and that can add lots of complication. It can create a lot of frustration at the senior executive level, because people always want to believe, when you've got that kind of entity turning up at your door, you want to act on it for good reason. But it can take a lot of really useful time out of a system at a time where there isn't any spare time.
And a quick interjection here, that these are some of the difficulties that you can potentially resolve or certainly improve by some of the pre-breach preparations.
In terms of incident response, if you already know the victim, how their systems, you know the people, the drills, that will make a fundamentally sort of tangible difference to how quickly and how efficiently you can sort of respond to the incident.
Enormously so. And so your mention of the first call, and when you're going through asking those questions, if we've done that 3 months earlier, and we've already asked those same questions, and it's actually a validation exercise, and because when we did it 3 months earlier, it wasn't a Saturday morning at 2 a.m, it was a reasonable time that had been scheduled in everyone's diaries, and we didn't just have the IT team, we had certain parts of the operational part of the business that understood the wider context. So when we're running through, we can say, well, you told us this, is that still the case? Yes, no. You're not relying on someone's memory at an incredible stressful time. You're meeting with the best people at the best time.
And you've also presumably got a list then of the people you need on the calls.
Exactly.
You're not fishing around for who would be in charge of this, who knows it. you've got that structure in place already to go, okay, well, X deals with IT security, Y is the HR lead, and Z's going to be our sort of board level decision maker, and off you go.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. And I think threat actor engagement's a good example where the pre-breach testing can really pay dividends, because making a big decision such as, do we want to engage with a threat actor? Do we want to pay the ransom? If you're doing that for the first time, conceptually, in a live breach, it's going to be slow. There's going to be lots of people and stakeholders that need to be in the conversation, that need reassuring. There's going to be lots of questions around the legalities of payments, the mechanics, who makes payments, who speaks to the threat actor. All of that stuff can be worked through, when you're not in a crisis situation. So you've got a plan that's been tested, and that will just make your incident response go that much smoother and quicker, meaning you can recover faster.
And for the two of you, one question is, what does good look like when you're called in terms of a victim giving you information about where they are in terms of, say, from your point of view, perhaps Ollie, on system resilience, on backups?
So I think that the critical part is someone being able to see the wider organisation. So the best responses I've been part of have been with a senior CIO from the business that has probably got quite a lot of operational responsibility. They've been there for quite a lot of time. They understand the IT systems, but also how the actual human side of the business functions as well. Well, if you need to ask this kind of question about operations, you speak to that person. They understand how the business is going to react to this sudden change in risk. They have a good relationship with general counsel. That's really what good looks like. The opposite side of
So now I was going to say, one of the lessons then perhaps is for organisations to make sure that they are plugging their CIO into their sort of C-suite, into the GC, so that those relationships are there, so that when we come knocking,
I mean,
they can point us in the right direction. And same for you, Jamie. What are the sort of things where you go, I'm pleased to hear that?
Yeah, it's always nice when there's a very clear line of authority at who is making the decisions. Something that we've seen on more than one occasion, which can really slow things down, is a sort of decision paralysis, where it's such a big decision potentially. In some of these extreme cases, the future viability of the business can literally be, in question, and therefore having somebody who going to this person, you're going to get an answer, and that person has the authority to tell you yay or nay regarding a certain action. For example, turning off the network, making a ransom payment, bringing extra support in. All those are big questions which can consume a lot of time and resource, particularly when there's not a clear line of decision making. So that certainly makes not only my life easier, but I think the sort of victim organisations' recovery.
And do you see situations where there's a bit of a push-pull within the business? I remember one where people I worked with dealt with a logistics business where, classically, the threat actors hit you at a bad time. So, say, for example, you've got that Christmas run-up, you've got warehouses full of stuff, you need to deliver, you've been hit, and you've got that push-pull within the business. There are people going, I can't access my emails, and the chairman's sort of saying, someone get my email sorted out, whereas in fact, perhaps for the business, the important thing is to get into the warehouses, do a stock take, work out what needs to be where, start putting together systems that will enable the business to function, and you've got to park some of the sort of, you've got to identify what's a luxury, what's a must-have, I guess, early on. Do you see that sort of prioritisation process sort of emerge relatively early in a...
Yeah, you do. I mean, of course, you need to look at what has been the operational impact on the business from the cyber attack, and once you know that, then you can start to put in plan in place to sort of get back up and running. I'm not sure whether I'm pinching one of your sayings, Ollie, or whether from somewhere else, but once you've had the attack and you're starting to get back on your feet, you're starting to bring systems back online. So perhaps one at a time, one application first. So that usually, perhaps the finance application might be one of the earlier ones, and maybe HR. what you can sometimes have is what's sometimes referred to as a sort of a Hunger Games scenario where different business heads are competing for their application to be brought back online first.
Which is perfectly natural, I guess, but it's slightly
Yeah.
Darwinian that everyone's sort of jockeying for position to get in. And
Yeah, it's completely natural. And, from our perspective, we need to make sure it's done properly. So systems are, again, I'm speaking to Ollie's bit here, but we want to make sure that anything brought back online is clean, and we've verified it's clean, it's safe. We want to be, comfortable that, any risk of a sort of secondary or follow-on attack has been removed insofar as we can possibly have that assurance.
And if we've got that, I guess the two-pronged thing we see now with encryption and exfiltration, at what point, I guess, Ollie, it's for you, are you looking for traces of exfiltration?
So essentially immediately, but almost every incident these days, we know that that's going to be a critical work stream. The business being able to understand what's happened is so important. It runs in parallel with containment. So therefore, being able to be clear with the victim in this case, these are the kind of things we're going to be looking for. Please don't touch those kind of systems. Understanding when logs are likely to time out. You may only keep a week, 2-3 weeks or longer in logs. And taking a snapshot now, even if we're not going to start looking at them for a few days because we're prioritizing containment, doing that kind of stuff early allows you to make sure that you haven't made those kind of errors.
Yeah, as Ollie touched on, as far as exfiltration is concerned, pretty much every incident these days, ransomware incident, there'll be an exfiltration component. And you usually get quite quick confirmation of that. So there can be some telltale clues forensically. There may be a big spike in network traffic going to an unknown IP address, 2 o'clock in the morning, whatever it might be. But also the threat actors themselves, they've definitely shortened the amount of time that they take between carrying out the attack and then posting something on one of the leak sites. Might just be an allegation that they've taken the data. It might be initially a small snip of the data, very small sample. It might be that they've decided to talk directly to certain cyber journalists, again, as a sort of a pressure leverage tactic. And of course, all of these things, as you can imagine, significantly also feed into the comms strategy and what comms, if any, the business decides to sort of push out and when.
And is that sort of speed of action on the part of the threat actor perhaps a reaction to the fact that perhaps detection systems are better than they used to be? So if a large amount of data is taken out of a system, an alarm bell might sound somewhere, they know, for example, that might trigger a set of actions internally that might stop them going about their business. So they want to move a bit quicker than perhaps they used to when systems weren't as good at spotting that kind of.
So I think that's happening, what we used to call, or still to a certain degree called dwell time. So before they get in up to the point of encryption has decreased. That's happening much faster. Also, the time between encryption and a victim being aware of what's happened here and them being named has shortened because threat groups realise there's no real advantage to hanging around. They don't want to keep this data any longer than they need to in order to extort people. And I think to a certain degree they've realised that if an organisation hasn't paid in a certain amount of time, they're probably not going to. This is a numbers game for them. They're trying to roll through this as quickly as possible, which very much to Jamie's point around making sure that you're prepared to negotiate quickly is important. If you do want to engage, if you do need to either buy time or get additional information, not engaging fast enough could well be you may well be beaten to the punch by the press.
And well, I hope that was all very useful, and thank you for joining us, and we hope you will join us next time for the next episode in the series. Thank you very much.
Thank you for listening to Risk Matters, the DWF Insurance Podcast. We hope you join us again soon for future podcasts in our series.